5 people, 5 completely different wastelands, 5 stories that changed the course of post-war America in ways that most survivors never fully understood. The Vault Dweller, the Chosen One, the Lone Wanderer, the Courier, and the Sole Survivor. Each one of them walked into something impossible and walked back out. The other side changed in ways they could not have predicted and would never fully explain to anyone who was not there. They never met, but the question of what would happen if they did is one of the most interesting thought experiments the Fallout world has to offer, because these 5 people are not just ordinary survivors. They are 5 completely different answers to the same question, which is, what does the end of the world ask of the people it leaves behind, and what does it take from them in return? So today, we are putting them in the same room, one table, one fire, 5 legends, and we are going to figure out exactly how that conversation goes. The 5. Before the conversation starts, it helps to know who is sitting at the table, because these 5 people are not interchangeable, and they were not equally equipped for the same problems. The Vault Dweller came out of Vault 13 in 2161 as someone's solution to a water chip problem, and became the person who dismantled the Master's army before it could convert the entire western wasteland. He founded Arroyo afterward, wrote his memoirs, and disappeared into the wilderness sometime around 2208, leaving behind a village, a bloodline, and a republic he never intended to start. The Chosen One is his grandson, born in 2221 and sent out from that same village in 2241 to find a Garden of Eden creation kit before the tribe starved to death. He came back having stopped the Enclave from releasing an airborne FEV strain that would have killed virtually every living person in the wasteland. He did this with a group of people and friends he made along the way, and a self-destruct sequence on an oil rig. The Lone Wanderer was born in 2258 in the Jefferson Memorial during a failed attempt to purify Washington, D.C.'s water supply, and spent 19 years inside Vault 101 before being thrown into the Capitol Wasteland to find a father who had left without explanation. They ended up cleaning the water for millions of people, destroying the Eastern Enclave, and doing it all before turning 20. The Courier woke up in a shallow grave outside Good Springs, Nevada in 2281 with 2 bullets in their head and a grudge to settle, and then proceeded to decide the political future of the entire American Southwest by choosing which faction, if any, would control Hoover Dam. They had already, without knowing it, destroyed an entire settlement years earlier by delivering a package that activated buried nuclear missiles. They carry that knowledge and weight everywhere they go. The Sole Survivor was alive before the bombs fell. He remembers the old world the way none of the others can, not through stories or vault culture, but through direct lived experience. He had a house, a family, a working television, and plans for the morning of October 23, 2077 that the bombs interrupted. He woke up in 2287 in a cryogenic pod next to a dead wife with a stolen infant son somewhere in the ruins of Greater Boston. He saved the Commonwealth, ended the Institute, and rebuilt the Minutemen from 4 survivors in a museum. 5 people, 5 wastelands, 1 table. The conversation starts with the oldest person present, and it does not start gently. The Vault Dweller. The Vault Dweller does not say much at first. That is consistent with what we know about him. He was never a man who talked about himself easily, not to his tribe, not in his memoirs, not to anyone who tried to draw the full story out of him after he came back from the cathedral. But when he does speak, he speaks with the specific authority of someone who did it first, who went out into the wasteland before anyone at the table had been born, before the NCR existed, before New Vegas was anything other than a collection of pre-war casinos with the lights still on, and found that it was exactly as bad as it looked. He found that the mutant army was real and large and organized around an ideology that made a specific, horrible kind of sense. He found that surviving it required a particular willingness to keep moving when every reasonable instinct said, stop, and that the cost of that willingness was paid in people he cared about who did not make it. The thing the Vault Dweller carries that nobody else at the table carries in quite the same way is the exile. He saved Vault 13. He destroyed the Master. He walked back through the vault door and the Overseer met him outside it and told him he could not come home. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had changed too much and his example was dangerous. That is the wound that the other 4 can see, even if he does not talk about it directly. They can see it in the way he holds himself, in the careful distance he keeps from the idea of belonging anywhere, in the fact that he built Arroyo and then eventually left that too. The Vault Dweller understands, better than any of them, that saving the world and being able to live in it afterward are two completely different skills. And he is not sure he was ever especially good at the second one. He looks at the 4 people across from him, and he sees versions of the same problem he spent his entire life not quite solving. And that is where the conversation gets interesting. The courier and the Vault Dweller. The first real tension at the table is between the Vault Dweller and the courier, and it is a tension about intention. The Vault Dweller was sent out to do a specific thing and did it, and did not choose the scale of what followed. He did not intend to found a republic. He did not intend to become the origin point of the Chosen One's bloodline. He was trying to fix a water chip, and the consequences compounded outward from there in ways he could not have planned for and mostly did not know about. The courier is the opposite. The courier, by the time of the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, knew exactly what they were doing and chose it with full awareness of the consequences. They had already accidentally destroyed the divide by delivering a package from Navarro without knowing it contained the activation codes for buried ICBMs. The settlement they had been keeping alive through regular deliveries was obliterated. Everyone in it was killed. Ulysses, who had been there and survived, spent years afterward building an ideology of destruction and rebirth around that event, and around the courier's name specifically. They carried all of that into Hoover Dam, and when the moment came to decide the fate of the Mojave, they made a deliberate choice with deliberate intention, and they live with that in a way the Vault Dweller, whose consequences were largely accidental, does not have to. The Vault Dweller's consequences were accidental in the best possible sense. The couriers were chosen, and there is a version of the conversation at this table where the Vault Dweller, who carries guilt about Ian and Dogmeat and the people he lost along the way, cannot quite understand someone who walked into the largest political decision in the history of the Southwest with both eyes open. The courier does not apologize for it. That is what the Vault Dweller eventually respects about them. The courier made the call, they would make it again. The wasteland does not give you clean options, and the courier stopped expecting them a long time before Hoover Dam. These two understand each other in the end, because they both know what it is to carry something that the people around them will never fully comprehend. They just carry it differently. The Vault Dweller carries it quietly, in the particular stillness of someone who has made peace with the fact that the world he saved did not want him in it afterward. The courier carries it forward in constant motion, in the next contract and the next road and the next problem, because stopping is when it catches up, and the courier has not found a good reason to let it. They do not say any of this to each other directly. They do not need to. That is the specific relief of sitting across from someone who already knows. The Chosen One and the Lone Wanderer. The Chosen One and the Lone Wanderer find each other quickly at this table, and the reason is simple. They are the two people in the room who were sent by someone else and came back with something they did not go looking for. The Chosen One was sent to find a Gek. He came back having prevented the extinction of the human race on the Poseidon oil rig, and barely anyone outside his immediate circle ever knew. The Lone Wanderer was sent or forced into the capital wasteland to find their father. They came back having purified the water supply for millions of people and destroyed the Eastern Enclave in a conflict that started with a conversation in a vault and ended with a satellite strike on an Air Force base. Neither of them chose the scale of what they were asked to do. Both of them did it anyway, and both of them dealt with the aftermath in a specific kind of silence, because the people around them could not fully understand what it had cost. The Chosen One's particular loneliness is the anonymity of it. Almost nobody in the wasteland knows what happened on the oil rig. The NCR exists, New Arroyo exists, the wasteland keeps going, and the person who made all of that possible is just a name in a village's oral tradition that most people outside Arroyo have never heard of. He saved everyone, but nobody truly knows. The Lone Wanderer has the opposite problem. Everyone in the capital wasteland has an opinion about them. Three Dog talked about them on Galaxy News Radio for years. Moira Brown wrote about them in the Wasteland Survival Guide. They could not walk through Rivet City without someone recognizing them and having a feeling about it. The Lone Wanderer is famous in a wasteland that cannot agree on whether they were a hero or a disaster, and that specific kind of visibility is its own form of isolation. These two sit together and do not have to explain themselves. That is rare for both of them, and they both notice it. The sole survivor alone. The sole survivor does not fit cleanly anywhere at this table, and that is the the most accurate thing that can be said about him. The other four were shaped by the post-war world from the beginning. They grew up in vaults or tribal villages or highway settlements, and the wasteland was the environment that formed them. They know it from the inside in a way that is bone deep and not sentimental. The sole survivor grew up in a house in Sanctuary Hills, Massachusetts, with a working television and a morning commute, and a robot named Codsworth who mowed the lawn. He remembers what it felt like to live in the world before it ended, and he woke up 210 years later in a commonwealth that had no idea what to do with that memory, and neither did him. The other four listen when the sole survivor describes the old world, and none of them can quite follow the emotional register of, because for them the old world is history and archaeology, and the occasional pre-war relic found in a collapsed building. For the sole survivor, it is a Tuesday morning that happened a very long time ago, and is still the sharpest thing in his memory. What the sole survivor brings to this table that nobody else can bring is the perspective of someone who chose to keep going without any of the frameworks the others had access to. The Vault Dweller had vault culture, a community that had been preparing for survival for generations, a Pip-Boy, and a mission handed to him with a clear objective. The Chosen One had the tribe, the Temple of Trials, the Shaman Hakunin, and the weight of a chosen destiny that the village had been building toward for decades. The Lone Wanderer had the Vault, then Megaton, then Galaxy News Radio, then Rivet City, then the Brotherhood, a chain of institutional support that found them at every major turn. The Courier had 2 centuries of post-war road knowledge baked into their muscle memory and a wasteland that had been navigated and mapped and partially stabilized by the people who came before them. The sole survivor had Codsworth and a dead wife together with a missing child, and a world that had been someone else's problem for 210 years before he arrived in it. The sole survivor walked out of Vault 111 with nothing except the loss of his family and memories of a world 2 centuries gone, and he rebuilt the Minutemen from 4 people in a museum, dismantled the most secretive and powerful organization on the East Coast, and found their son in time to lose him to old age. The other 4 respect this without fully understanding it. The sole survivor is the only one at the table who did what they did entirely without precedent, in a world they were not built for, starting from a version of nothing that none of the others can quite picture. What they agree on. 5 people this different, who have been through 5 things this different, do not agree on much, but there are things that land the same way across all 5 of them, and it is worth paying attention to those things because they represent something true about the wasteland that no single story can carry alone. The first thing they agree on is that the institutions failed, all of them. The vaults were not shelters. They were experiments run on people who trusted the government with their lives. The Enclave, which presented itself as the legitimate continuation of the United States government, tried to commit genocide twice across the stories of these 5 people. The Brotherhood of Steel, which positioned itself as the guardian of technology and therefore of civilization, spent most of its existence hoarding both and sharing neither. The NCR, which built the most functional democracy in the post-war West, overextended itself into a stalemate it could not win, and a bureaucracy that strangled the people it was supposed to serve. Every person at this table was, at some point, either failed by one of these institutions or forced to operate in spite of one. The Vault Dweller was exiled by his own vault. The Chosen One watched the Enclave abduct his entire tribe. The Lone Wanderer watched the Enclave kill their father in a room he flooded with radiation to prevent them from taking his life's work. The Courier had the Brotherhood's Mojave chapter as a persistent problem that could only be resolved by elimination or alliance. The sole survivor had to choose between the Brotherhood, the Railroad, the Institute, and the Minutemen in a conflict where none of the options were clean and all of them cost something. They agree that the people who survived did so in spite of the systems that claimed to protect them, not because of those systems. And they agree, without saying it explicitly, but in the way they all hold the same careful silence when the subject comes up, that the most dangerous thing about those systems was not that they failed, it was that they failed while believing they were succeeding. The Overseer exiled the Vault Dweller while genuinely believing it was the right call for the Vault. The Enclave launched its FEV program while genuinely believing it was restoring America. Eden broadcast his radio shows while genuinely believing he was leading. The conviction was the problem. It always is. The second thing they agree on is quieter and harder to say out loud, but it is there in the way all 5 of them hold themselves at this table. None of them got got to stop. The Vault Dweller saved Vault 13 and was exiled and built Arroyo, and eventually left that too. The Chosen One saved the world and went home to lead a village. The Lone Wanderer cleaned the water and then went back out to destroy an Air Force base. The Courier decided the fate of the Mojave and had already, before that, survived the Sierra Madre and Zion Canyon and the Big MT. The sole survivor dismantled the Institute, and the wasteland kept going, and the Minutemen needed a general, and Codsworth was still there, mowing the dead grass. None of them were allowed a clean ending. The wasteland does not offer those. What they would tell each other. If this conversation happens honestly, which is the only way it is worth imagining it happening, then at some point the performance drops. The version of themselves they maintain for the people around them at home. The version that is functional and forward-looking and does not burden anyone with the weight of what it actually cost, gives way to something more accurate. And what comes out in that gap, the thing each of them says that they have never quite managed to say to anyone who was not in the room when it happened, is the part that matters most. The Vault Dweller tells them about Ian, about the flamethrower, about the specific guilt of a person who was supposed to be leading and watched someone follow them into something that killed them. He has been carrying that since 2162, and his memoirs mention it but do not resolve it, because some things cannot be resolved in writing, and he knew that when he wrote them. The Chosen One tells them about Arroyo, about coming back to a village that had been taken while he was away, looking for the tool that was supposed to save it, about the specific helplessness of arriving to find the people you were trying to help already gone. The Lone Wanderer tells them about the activation code, about entering Revelation 21:6 into the terminal because it was their mother's favorite Bible verse, and their father quoted it to them their entire childhood, and their mother died the day they were born, and that was the only thing of her they ever had. Nobody who was not in that control chamber can understand what that moment cost. The Courier tells them about Ulysses, about the Divide, about delivering a package that activated nuclear missiles buried under a settlement they had been helping keep alive, and destroying it accidentally, and spending years not knowing and then finding out. The Vault Dweller's guilt about Ian is the guilt of a leader who lost someone in the field. The Courier's guilt about the Divide is the guilt of someone who changed the world by doing something completely ordinary, without malice, without awareness, and without any way to take it back. The sole survivor does not tell them about Sean, not directly, but they tell them what it is like to remember the old world. And for the first time in the conversation, all four of the others go quiet and just listen, because the Vault Dweller knows the pre-war world only through books and other people's memories. The Chosen One knows it through the Vault Dweller's memoirs and the fragments of culture Arroyo preserved. The Lone Wanderer knows it through the Jefferson Memorial and Vault 101 and the holotapes their father left behind. The Courier knows it through ruins and ruins and more ruins. None of them know it the way the sole survivor knows it. And the sole survivor, for the first time in 210 years of post-war life, says what the old world actually felt like to be inside, and the table is quiet for a long time after. The result, the conversation ends without a resolution, because 5 people this different, who saved 5 different versions of the world in 5 different ways, and who carry 5 different versions of what that cost them, do not arrive at ideal conclusions. That is not a failure of the conversation. It is the conversation being honest about what these 5 lives actually add up to, which is not a lesson and not a moral and not a clean argument for how the wasteland should be organized. It is 5 people who found themselves at the intersection of impossible circumstances and personal character who made it through to the other side, each in their own way, each at their own price. But they leave knowing something they did not know before they sat down. The Vault Dweller leaves knowing that what he started did not end with him, and that the line from his short straw in a vault lottery to the sole survivor's story in a city 2,000 miles away is longer and stranger and more consequential than any single person's life was ever supposed to be. The Chosen One leaves knowing that the anonymity he has carried since the oil rig, the feeling that nobody knows and nobody will ever really understand, is not as complete as he thought. 4 people at a table understood. The Lone Wanderer leaves knowing that the water is still clean in the capital wasteland, and that Deacon of the Railroad confirmed it years after the events of Fallout 3, and that the Wasteland Survival Guide Moira Brown published spread practical knowledge across the continent and kept people alive who would not have survived without it, and that the thing they gave up their childhood to finish is still working 2 decades later. That is a specific kind of peace that the wasteland rarely hands out. It does not give it back once it takes it away. The lone wanderer takes it with both hands. And so, the courier who cheated death in a cemetery outside Goodsprings did cheat death once again. And the courier leaves knowing that the choices they made at Hoover Dam were the right ones for the reasons they made them. And the wasteland was forever changed. Not because anyone at the table validated those choices, but because sitting across from 4 other people who made enormous decisions in impossible situations and lived with the consequences without apologizing for them makes it easier to hold the ones they made. The sole survivor leaves knowing something simpler and harder than all of that, which is that he is not the only one who could not go home. None of them could. The wasteland takes that from everyone it shapes in this way. It takes the home and it takes the version of the person that could have lived in it, and it gives back something harder and stranger and occasionally worth having. 5 people, 5 wastelands, 5 stories that the wasteland never connected and never needed to, because the connections were already there in the structure of what each of them was asked to do and what each of them chose to give in order to do it. One very long night around one fire in a version of events the timeline does not allow for and should have. The wasteland did not get a better world out of any of them for free. It took everything first, and then it asked for more, and then it asked again, and all 5 of them kept paying the price because the alternative was letting the thing they had paid for mean nothing. And what the wasteland got in return was 5 people who refused, each in their own way, to let that be the end of the story. And so, our protagonists' roads come to an end for now. In the new world of their respective wastelands, fighting continued, blood was spilled, and many lived and died just as they had in the old world, because war never changes. And if you've enjoyed the video and want to see every one of these protagonists ranked by the legacy they left behind, click the video on the screen.